The Renia dispersion adhesives can bond most materials that our solvent-based adhesives can work on. But there are some things you need to keep in mind. The first is that we are dealing with water here. So dispersions are water-based. We do not have solvents in them. That is a great advantage, but it can also have a downside, and that downside comes out whenever oily, greasy materials are involved. These surface impurities or even these components in the material are dealt with relatively well by solvent-based adhesives, by those organic solvents. Organic solvents can dissolve these fatty, oily surface impurities, not really remove them, but help the adhesive deal with them. This is not the case for water-based adhesives. Water-based adhesives can only work if the surface is fat-free, oil-free, clean. Oil and water don't mix, that's a general rule. So you need to take other measures. You need to make sure that the surface is sufficiently rough and even anyway. So grinding, sanding usually helps, but that can take or drag such oily, fatty compounds in the material to the surface. For instance, when working on vinyl, when working on chrome 10 leather or certain rubber types. So you need to make sure to clean the surface after the grinding if that is an issue. So if you feel or see anything oily, fatty on the surface. This can be achieved by using solvents, which is of course a bit of a departing from the solvent-free way, but if this is the only way to get the bond to hold, well, that is what you have to do. You're using less solvent than you would using a solvent-based adhesive. There are non-solvent-based cleaners that are more operating on a soap-based base, but these come with challenges as well. You need to make sure that the remnants of the soapy materials and the oily materials are really cleaned off the surface and do not just remain there and are kind of massaged into the material. So it can be a bit of a challenge. The other concern I mentioned already, grinding is very important, even more so, not just from a surface cleaning standpoint, but also to make the material sufficiently rough so the adhesive has something to grab onto. Another aspect we have to consider is absorption. Water evaporates much slower than solvents, so if it is absorbed into the material, that even enhances that effect. But it really depends. If we're looking at an absorbent material such as leather, water is absorbed, yes, but leather has sort of a, let's call it a wick effect. It drags the water away. It absorbs it into the whole material. It doesn't store it. It even helps it evaporate a little bit. And leather cannot be compressed. So this is the great difference to the more spongy materials such as polyurethane foam that also absorb water, but that hold the water in its open cell structure and that will push it out again when compressed, because these materials are compressible. This becomes relevant when you put the pieces together. You think the surface is dry, but actually it has a layer of water or liquid adhesive under it that is then pushed up when you press the materials together and pushes the surface layer off. So if you're working on foamed, on expanded materials, it is very important to properly dry them, and this can be achieved in the easiest way and with the least time when you heat them. So put them in the oven. Heat lamp or a heat gun is not quite as effective. If you're bonding foams, I would always bond them warm. I would always heat them to achieve the best results. Generally, dispersion adhesives are not as effective on most plasticky materials, especially if the surface is very smooth. Even with sanding, you won't get as good results on compact polyethylene, polypropylene as you would get with our Renia Ortec, for instance. Now, Ortec has the additional advantage of having adhesion promoters that work really well on those materials, which are not in the Aquilin 315, for instance, but also the solvents can help you along there, which in case of dispersions, they don't. This is something to keep in mind. The other consideration in general when working with adhesives is pressure. Adhesives, water-based adhesives generally need more pressure than their solvent-based counterparts. So depending on what you do, if you want to repair a shoe, if you want to modify a shoe and you won't have a fitting last, or you couldn't get a fitting last into the shoe again, it is generally better to work, or easier to work with solvent-based adhesives compared to water-based, because you cannot get the pressure evenly onto every bit of the surface, which is still important with solvent-based adhesives, but not as critical as it would be with dispersions. So generally, if you keep those limitations in mind, if you keep these challenges in mind, solvent-based adhesives can do a great job on most materials. On some, especially greasy surfaces, greasy materials, it can be a bit challenging. And on some materials like polyethylene, polypropylene, a solvent-based adhesive, the proper solvent-based adhesive is still a better choice. But if you keep that in mind, they can still do a very good job for you.